Hello! I decided to learn how to play Minecraft, so while I play, sit back and listen to this story. Like the video, follow the channel, and drop a comment with what you think. My best friend had a copy of my apartment key that I never gave her. I found the spare key by accident, which is the part that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. Because if I hadn't dropped my phone that night, I might never have known. My best friend Nat and I had been close for 11 years. The kind of close where people used to ask if we were sisters. The kind of close where I genuinely believed there was nothing about my life she didn't already know. We met in college, survived 2 bad roommates and 1 worse boyfriend together, and somewhere along the way, she became the person I called before I called my own mother. So when I say I trusted her completely, I need you to understand that I mean it in the most uncomplicated way a person can mean it. I never once, not for a second, thought to question where she might have gotten a key to my apartment, because as far as I knew, she never had one. That night started ordinary, in the most boring way possible. We were at her place for a wine night. Nothing special, just the 2 of us complaining about work and picking apart a show we were both pretending to still like. Around 11, I stood up to get my bag, and my phone slipped out of the side pocket and skidded under her console table. I got down on my knees to grab it, and that's when I saw her key bowl. She kept it there by habit. Spare keys to her car, her parents' place, an old gym locker she never used anymore. The kind of clutter everyone has sitting in a bowl somewhere. And right in the middle of it, plain as anything, was a key with a blue rubber cap. The exact same blue rubber cap I put on my own apartment key 2 years ago, after I lost the original 3 times in 1 month and got tired of buying new copies. I stayed frozen on the floor for a second, telling myself it was a coincidence, that plenty of people use those little rubber caps, that I was being paranoid over nothing. Then I picked it up and turned it over, and there, scratched faintly into the metal, was the tiny nick my key always had. The one from when I jammed it in my car door lock years ago and bent it just slightly out of shape. I know my own key. I have looked at it every single day for 2 years. This was not a similar key. This was mine, or a perfect copy of mine, sitting in my best friend's bowl like it belonged there. I didn't say anything that night. I want to be honest about that, because later people acted like I should have confronted her immediately, screamed, demanded answers on the spot. But my brain didn't work like that in the moment. My brain went very quiet and very careful, the way it does when something feels dangerous before you've even figured out why. I put the key back exactly where it had been. I picked up my phone, made some comment about how tired I was, and left 20 minutes later than I normally would have, because I didn't want her to notice anything had shifted. I drove home with both hands gripping the wheel too tightly, going over every possible explanation. Maybe I had given her a key years ago and forgotten. Maybe there had been some emergency, a time I was out of town and needed someone to water a plant, and she'd had one made and simply never mentioned giving it back. I wanted so badly to land on an explanation that made sense. Something boring, something forgettable. But the more I turned it over, the more I realized I had never, not once, given Nat a key to my apartment. I had never needed to. I didn't have plants. I didn't travel enough to need a favor like that. And even if I had, I would have remembered it, because giving someone a key to your home is not a small thing. Not to me. It's the kind of thing you think about before you do it. That night, I lay in bed with my own set of keys resting on my nightstand, staring at the blue cap on mine, and thinking about the one sitting in her bowl. And I felt something crawl up the back of my neck that I couldn't name yet. Because a key doesn't just appear. Someone has to make it. Someone has to hand over the original long enough to have it copied. Someone has to want a way into your home badly enough to go through the trouble. And whoever that someone was, it apparently wasn't me. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, which never happens. And I lay there running the math again, like it would somehow change if I did it enough times. 2 years. That key had a nick in it that I put there myself, the specific bend from the car door. The same blue rubber cap I bought from the same hardware store because the original tag on it was orange and I hated orange. There was no version of this where that key was a coincidence. So the question wasn't whether it was mine. The question was how long it had been sitting in that bowl and what she had done with it and why. I almost called her right then. I actually picked up my phone and opened our messages, my thumb hovering over the little microphone icon, like I was going to send a voice memo demanding an explanation before I'd even brushed my teeth. Then I put the phone down, because some instinct in me, the same instinct that told me to stay quiet the night before, said that if I asked her directly, she would have an answer ready. Nat was quick like that. She could talk her way out of almost anything. Not because she was a liar exactly, but because she was smart, and smart people are good at making bad things sound reasonable in the moment. I didn't want a reasonable-sounding explanation. I wanted the truth, and I had a feeling those were not going to be the same thing. So instead of confronting her, I did something I'm not proud of. I started paying attention. Not in a dramatic way, nothing like following her around or anything you'd see in a movie. I just started noticing things I had apparently trained myself not to notice before. Like how she always knew small details about my apartment that I didn't remember telling her. She once mentioned, in passing, that my new couch cushions looked nice, except I hadn't invited her over since I bought them. I laughed it off at the time, assumed I'd sent her a photo and forgotten. But now, looking back, I couldn't find that photo anywhere in our chat history. I scrolled through months of messages that night, back before the wine night, back before any of this, and there was nothing. No photo of the cushions, no conversation about the couch at all. She just knew. Another time, weeks earlier, she'd ask if I'd finally fixed the dripping faucet in my bathroom. I hadn't told her about the faucet. I remembered being annoyed about it, remembered complaining out loud to myself while I fixed it, alone, in my apartment, on a random Tuesday evening. I never mentioned it to anyone, not even in a text. When I brought it up to myself again that night, really sat with it, my hands started shaking a little. Because there's a difference between someone knowing things about your life because you tell them, and someone knowing things about your life because they've been inside it when you weren't there. I decided I needed proof, not suspicion. Not a spiraling list of half-remembered comments that could still, technically, have innocent explanations. I needed something concrete, so I did the one thing that felt both insane and completely necessary. I bought a small camera, the kind people use for porch deliveries, and I set it up inside my apartment, pointed at the front door, tucked on a bookshelf where it wouldn't be obvious unless you were looking for it. I told myself I was probably wasting $40 on nothing, that in a week I'd feel silly for doubting my best friend over a key that probably had some explanation I just hadn't thought of yet. Part of me wanted that to be true so badly. Part of me was already grieving something I hadn't confirmed yet, because if I was right, if there really was no explanation, it meant the last 2 years of my life had contained a version of privacy that never actually existed. Every argument I'd had with my boyfriend at the time, every messy morning after a bad night, every private moment I assumed was mine alone in my own home, all of it might have had witnesses I never agreed to. I went about my week like everything was normal. I met Nat for lunch on Wednesday and let her talk about her weekend plans. Watched her laugh at her own joke. Watched her reach for my fries without asking like she always did. Like nothing between us had shifted at all. And the whole time, some small, cold part of me was watching her from a distance, cataloging every gesture, wondering how much of the person sitting across from me was real and how much was performance. She asked if I was okay. I said I was just tired from work. She believed me instantly. No hesitation, no suspicion in her eyes at all. And something about how easily she believed my lie made me wonder how many lies she had already gotten away with telling me. That Thursday night, I checked the camera app before bed, half expecting nothing, already preparing the speech I'd give myself about being paranoid. There was one clip flagged from earlier that day, time-stamped for 2:14 in the afternoon, a time I was at work, a time my apartment should have been completely empty. My hands were cold by the time I actually pressed play, and I remember thinking, in this strange, detached way, that I could still stop, that I could close the app and go back to not knowing. And some part of that felt tempting for exactly as long as it took the video to load. Then the front door opened, and there she was, Nat, in the cardigan I'd seen her wear 100 times, letting herself into my apartment with my key, like she'd done it before, like her body already knew the motion. No hesitation at the lock, no fumbling to figure out which key fit. She walked in and closed the door behind her, and for a second she just stood there in my living room, looking around slowly, the way you look at a place you know well but haven't seen in a little while. I watched her walk toward my kitchen and out of frame, and I sat there in my bed with my phone shaking in my hand, feeling something that wasn't quite anger yet, more like the floor tilting under a life I thought had been steady. The clip ran almost 11 minutes. She came back into frame near the end, holding one of my mugs, the blue one with the chip on the handle that I never used, because I always meant to throw it away and never did. She rinsed it at my sink, out of view, then came back holding it clean and set it exactly back where it always sat, third shelf, second from the left, in a way that told me this wasn't the first time she'd done this either. She knew exactly where things went. Before she left, she paused by my bookshelf, close enough that for one terrifying second I thought she'd spotted the camera, and my whole body locked up, watching it happen on a 5-day-old recording like I could somehow warn myself. She didn't see it. She just straightened a picture frame that had been slightly crooked, something I hadn't even noticed was crooked, and let herself back out, locking the door behind her the same way she'd opened it, practiced, familiar, like she was tidying up after herself in a home she considered partly hers. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my laptop and went back through the footage from earlier in the week. And there she was again, twice more. Both times in the middle of the day when I was at work. Both times for less than 15 minutes. Both times doing almost nothing, standing in my living room, sitting briefly on my couch. Once, just once, going into my bedroom and standing in the doorway for almost a full minute without moving, just looking, before turning around and leaving again. She never took anything. That was somehow the part that unsettled me most. If she'd been stealing from me, I could have understood it as something ugly but at least explainable. A friend with a problem, a friend in debt, something with a shape to it. But she wasn't stealing. She was just being there, existing quietly inside my life when I wasn't around to know it, like she needed to feel close to something that wasn't fully hers. I thought about confronting her that same week and talked myself out of it 3 separate times, because I kept needing to understand the why before I could stand to hear whatever she was going to say. I started going back further in my memory, further than the couch, further than the faucet, trying to figure out how long this had actually been happening. And that's when I remembered something I'd buried without realizing I'd buried it. 2 years ago, right around the time I got the blue rubber cap for my key, I'd had it made because I lost my original set for almost a week and panicked, assuming I'd dropped it somewhere on campus or left it at a bar. Nat was the one who suggested getting a spare made, just in case. The one who drove me to the hardware store. The one who stood next to me at the little key machine while the new copy was cut. I remembered her insisting on holding my original while I dug through my wallet for cash, just for a second, just to be helpful. I had thought nothing of it at the time. Why would I? She was my best friend. It never occurred to me, not once in 2 years, to wonder whether that borrowed second had been long enough for her to slip away and get a copy made herself, somewhere else. Sometime that same week, before quietly handing my original back like nothing had happened. Sitting there at 2 in the morning, with the footage paused on her standing in my bedroom doorway, I finally let myself consider the timeline all the way through, and it made a horrible kind of sense. This hadn't started last month. It hadn't started with the couch or the faucet. It had started 2 years ago. The exact same week I got that key copied. The exact same week I trusted her enough to hand her my only set without a second thought, because handing things to Nat had never once, in 11 years, felt like something I needed to think twice about.
I didn't confront her the next day, or the day after that, and I want to explain why, because I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I was being weak, or naive, or letting something enormous slide just to keep the peace. But the truth is, I needed to understand the shape of it before I could stand in front of her and demand an answer. Because I already knew Nat well enough to know that if I came to her with half a story, she would fill in the other half herself, and I would walk away more confused than when I started. So I kept the camera running. I told myself I was gathering evidence. But really, I think I was gathering courage, because some part of me still wanted there to be an explanation I hadn't thought of, even after everything I'd already seen. That weekend, she texted asking if I wanted to come over for our usual Sunday thing. Wine, a show, the same routine we'd had for years. I said yes. I sat across from her on her couch, in the same room where I first spotted that key, and I studied her in a way I never had before. I noticed how comfortable she was, how settled into her own space, and I found myself wondering what it might feel like to walk into someone else's home the way she apparently walked into mine. Casually, like ownership, like it cost her nothing. At one point, she got up to refill our glasses, and without thinking, I glanced at that same bowl by her console table. The key was gone. Not moved, not tucked under something else. Gone entirely. My stomach dropped in a way that felt almost worse than seeing it there in the first place, because it meant she'd noticed something, or worried about something, enough to move it somewhere I couldn't see. I didn't say anything. I smiled when she came back with the wine, and I hated myself a little for how easy the smile came, how practiced I already was at hiding what I knew, like I'd absorbed the skill from watching her use it on me for who knew how long. That night, driving home, I called my boyfriend at the time, David, and told him everything. The key, the footage, the mug, the timeline. He went quiet on the other end for a long time, and then he said something that stuck with me more than I expected. He said, "You need to find out if this is just about you, or if it's about something bigger." I didn't understand what he meant at first, and he explained that people don't usually do something like this in isolation. That patterns like this often have a root, some need being met, some emptiness being filled, and that if I only focused on being angry, I might miss whatever was actually happening underneath it. I hated that he was probably right, because anger felt so much simpler than curiosity in that moment. But I decided to hold off a little longer, and instead of confronting Nat directly, I did something I'm still not entirely proud of. I reached out to her ex-roommate, a woman named Priya, who I'd stayed loosely in touch with, someone who had lived with Nat for almost 2 years before I even met her. I framed it casually, said I was thinking about getting a roommate myself and wanted advice. Asked what it had been like living with Nat. Priya laughed at first, said Nat was great, easy to live with, clean, considerate. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said something that made my whole body go cold. She said the only strange thing was that Nat used to let herself into Priya's room sometimes when Priya wasn't home. Not to take anything, just to sit or straighten things. Or once, memorably, to lie on Priya's bed for a while. Priya had laughed about it back then, chalked it up to Nat being lonely after a bad breakup. Said she found it a little odd, but harmless. The kind of thing you overlook in a friend you love. She said it stopped eventually, around the time Nat moved out and got her own place. And Priya assumed it had just been a phase, tied to that specific rough patch in Nat's life. I sat there, holding the phone, feeling like the floor had tilted again, because this wasn't isolated. This wasn't about me specifically, or not only about me. This was a pattern that had existed before I ever met her. Something that had simply found a new home once I became her closest friend. Once my apartment became the space she orbited instead of Priya's. I thanked Priya, hung up, and sat in my car outside my own building for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Because now, I had a bigger question than the one I started with. It wasn't just, what is she doing in my apartment? It was, what does she need so badly that she's willing to let herself quietly into the private spaces of the people she loves most? Again and again, across years, across different homes, different friendships, like she was looking for something she could never quite find once she got there. And underneath that question was a colder one I didn't want to look at directly yet. If this had happened before, with someone else, and no one had ever really stopped it, then what made me think it would stop with me? I decided the next step had to be a real conversation, not an ambush, not something screamed across her living room, but something deliberate. Because I kept thinking about what David said, that there might be something underneath this that mattered more than my own hurt feelings in the moment. That didn't mean I wasn't hurt. I want to be clear about that, because in the days leading up to it, I cried more than I let anyone see, mostly in my car, mostly at red lights. This strange grief for a friendship I hadn't technically lost yet, but already knew wouldn't survive in the same shape once I said what I needed to say. I picked a Tuesday evening, because Tuesdays were quiet for both of us. No plans, no reason to rush through anything. I didn't tell her what it was about. I just said we needed to talk, and I heard the small pause on her end of the line before she agreed, like some part of her already suspected. I went to her apartment instead of inviting her to mine, which felt important somehow, like I wanted this conversation to happen on ground that was fully hers. No shared history in the walls to soften anything. She opened the door already looking nervous, and I remember thinking, even then, some old reflex in me wanted to comfort her, wanted to tell her it was fine before I even knew if it was going to be fine. I sat down across from her and put my phone on the table between us, screen up, the video app already open. I didn't say anything dramatic. I just pressed play and watched her face while she watched herself walk into my apartment, use my key, rinse my mug, stand in my bedroom doorway for a full minute without moving. Her face went through something complicated while she watched it. Not quite shock, more like watching a secret she'd carried so long finally exist outside of her own head. When the clip ended, she didn't try to lie, which surprised me. And honestly, it was the first thing that made me think there might be something real underneath this. Because Nat could talk her way out of almost anything, and she didn't even try. She just sat there for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, that she didn't know how to explain it in a way that would make sense to me, but she was going to try anyway. She told me it started the week we got that spare key made, that she'd asked to hold my original for a second at the counter, not planning anything, and then, standing there, some impulse she still couldn't fully name took over, and she quietly told the clerk to cut a second copy, paid for it herself in cash before I even noticed, and slipped it into her own pocket before handing my key back like nothing had happened. She said she almost threw it away that same night. She said she carried it around for weeks feeling sick about it, telling herself she'd never actually use it, that having it was enough, some strange comfort just knowing it existed. Then one afternoon, months later, she was having a terrible day. Said everything in her own life felt unstable. Her job, her family, a breakup she still hadn't fully recovered from. And she found herself driving toward my apartment instead of her own. And before she'd even decided to do it, she was standing in my kitchen. She said it didn't feel like breaking in. She said, and this is the part that stuck with me most, that it felt like visiting a version of stability she didn't have anywhere else. standing in a home that felt safe and put together, even though it wasn't hers. Especially because it wasn't hers. Like she could borrow the feeling of it for 15 minutes and then go back to her own unstable life a little steadier. I asked her about Priya, and her face changed again. Something like shame settling into it fully for the first time. She admitted it, said it had started even earlier than I realized, that this wasn't new behavior invented for me specifically, that she'd done something similar during a hard stretch years before we even met, and that she'd told herself once she was in a better place, it would stop. And it had for a while, until her life felt shaky again, and the impulse came back. And this time, it attached itself to me, to my apartment, because I was the safest, steadiest person she had. I sat there, listening to all of it, and I felt this strange, unwanted swell of sympathy, fighting against everything else I was feeling. Because it was one thing to imagine her as someone cruel or calculating, and another to sit across from her and realize she was just deeply, quietly unwell in a way she'd never told anyone, not even me, especially not me, because I was the person she needed to believe was fine, needed to believe didn't know. But sympathy and forgiveness are not the same thing. And I want to be honest that even as I sat there, understanding her a little better, I still felt this cold, steady anger sitting right alongside it. Because understanding why someone violates your privacy doesn't undo the violation. And I needed her to know that both things could be true at once. I told her I believed that she was struggling, that I could see now this wasn't some calculated plan to hurt me, but that it didn't change the fact that for 2 years, she had let herself into my home without my knowledge, had been present in spaces where I believed I was completely alone, had touched my things, moved through my bedroom, existed inside my privacy in a way I never once consented to. I told her that no matter how sad or lonely or unstable she'd been feeling, that didn't give her the right to take that specific kind of comfort from me without asking. Because if she had asked, if she had ever once said, "Hey, can I come sit in your apartment sometimes when things feel too much?" I would have said yes without hesitation. That was the part that actually made me the angriest once I sat with it long enough. That she never even had to do this secretly. That I would have opened that door for her willingly if she'd only asked. And instead, she took the choice away from me entirely, decided on her own that my consent wasn't necessary, that my comfort mattered more than my right to know who had access to my own home. She started crying then, really crying. Not the performative kind I'd started to suspect her of over the past week, but something that looked genuinely broken. And she said she knew she couldn't undo it, that she wasn't asking me to just get over it, that she understood if I needed space, if I needed time, if I never fully trusted her the same way again. I told her I needed the key back, the actual physical key, immediately, that night, and she went and got it from wherever she'd hidden it after moving it out of that bowl, and handed it to me without argument. I told her I was changing my locks the next morning, regardless. Not as a punishment exactly, just as a fact. Because there was no version of this where I could sleep peacefully again, knowing a copy had existed for 2 years without my knowledge. Even if this was the only one, she said she understood. I told her I needed real space. Not a dramatic cutoff exactly, but distance. Time to figure out what I actually felt once the shock wore off. Because right now, everything was tangled together. Sympathy and rage and grief for a friendship that used to feel uncomplicated. And I couldn't trust any decision I made in that state. She agreed to that too, quietly, like she'd already expected it. Like some part of her had been bracing for this conversation for 2 years, without ever letting herself imagine exactly how it would go. I left her apartment that night feeling strange in a way I still don't fully have words for. Lighter, in one sense, because the secret wasn't a secret anymore. Heavier, in another, because now I had to actually sit with everything it meant. Not just about her, but about how much of my life had happened in front of an audience I never chose. I went home and changed the locks myself that same week, ordered a kit online, and watched a video tutorial at midnight because I couldn't stand the idea of waiting even one more day with the old ones still functioning, still capable of letting someone in without my knowledge. I told David everything, the full conversation, her explanation, the crying, all of it. And he listened without interrupting, and when I was done, he asked how I felt. And I said I honestly didn't know yet, that I felt like several different versions of myself were arguing about it at once. One that wanted to cut Nat off completely and never speak to her again. One that felt a strange, protective pull toward her because I'd known her 11 years and knew this wasn't the whole truth of who she was. And one that just felt exhausted, wanting nothing more than to stop thinking about it for even a single hour. I didn't talk to Nat for almost 3 weeks after that. She didn't push. She sent one message a few days in, short, just saying she understood if I needed more time, that she wasn't going anywhere, that she was in therapy now, had started the week after our conversation, and wanted me to know that regardless of what happened between us, she was trying to actually deal with whatever this was, instead of just being sorry about it. I didn't respond to that message for several days. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I genuinely didn't know yet what I wanted to say back.
During those 3 weeks of silence, I found myself doing something I hadn't expected, which was going back through years of memories with a completely different lens, trying to figure out how many small, strange moments I had explained away without ever questioning them properly. I remembered a night almost a year earlier when I came home from a work trip and felt certain, for just a second, that my apartment smelled different, like a candle had been burning that I hadn't lit. And I'd laughed it off at the time, blamed it on being tired from travel, blamed it on my own imagination. I remembered finding a hair tie on my bathroom counter once that wasn't mine, and assuming it had fallen out of my own bag at some point, never once considering it might belong to someone else entirely. Each memory on its own felt small enough to dismiss, which I think is exactly why it worked for as long as it did, because no single detail was enough to make me suspicious. And it was only once I had the full picture that all those tiny, forgettable moments rearranged themselves into something coherent and unsettling. I started talking to a therapist myself during that stretch, something I'd been putting off for unrelated reasons for months. And having an outside person to say all of this to, someone with no history with either of us, helped me more than I expected. She asked me a question early on that I kept turning over for days afterward. She asked whether my anger was really about the privacy violation itself, or whether some of it was about what the violation revealed. That the version of intimacy I thought we had wasn't fully real. That Nat had been managing a whole private struggle for years without ever trusting me enough to just say it out loud. That question cracked something open in me, because I realized a lot of my hurt wasn't just about the key or the footage. It was about realizing that even in a friendship I thought was completely honest, there had been an entire hidden room I never knew existed. And it made me wonder what else might be sitting behind other doors I hadn't thought to check. Around the second week of silence, my sister, who I'd told the whole story to almost immediately, asked me directly whether I thought I'd ever be friends with Nat again in any real sense. And I remember not having an answer, saying that I honestly didn't know if trust like that could be rebuilt once it had been broken in a way this specific and this strange. That this wasn't a lie about being busy or a canceled plan, or even a betrayal in the more familiar sense. This was something closer to a boundary I hadn't even known needed defending, because I never imagined I'd have to specify out loud that letting yourself into someone's home without asking wasn't acceptable. The same way you don't think to specify that someone shouldn't read your diary because you assume basic respect for privacy is simply understood between people who love each other. My sister pointed out something I hadn't fully considered, that the fact I was even still thinking this hard about the friendship, still weighing whether it could survive, said something too. That if this had happened with someone I didn't actually care about, I probably would have cut them off within the hour and never looked back. And the fact that I was sitting with it this long meant some part of me still valued whatever the friendship had been outside of this one enormous violation. I didn't know what to do with that observation at the time, but it stayed with me. Near the end of the third week, Nat sent another message. Longer this time. No pressure in it, just an update. She said her therapist had helped her understand that what she'd been doing was connected to a much older pattern from her childhood. Something about growing up in a house that never felt emotionally safe, a father who was unpredictable, a mother who checked out entirely rather than intervene, and how Nat had apparently spent years as a kid finding small, quiet ways to feel some sense of control or safety inside spaces that weren't technically hers. Sneaking into a neighbor's yard just to sit under a specific tree, staying inside a school building alone after hours because it felt calmer than home. She said her therapist believed this had evolved, as she got older, into a need to physically be inside spaces she associated with stability and safety, even when she had no right to be there, especially when she had no right to be there, because there was something about borrowing safety she hadn't been given permission to have that felt more real to her than being invited in properly. I read that message 3 times, and I felt something shift slightly. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something closer to the beginning of understanding that this had never really been about me at all. Even though it had happened entirely within my life, I decided to meet her again, not as a full reconciliation, but as a real conversation with more context than we'd had the first time, back when everything was still raw and reactive on both sides. We met at a coffee shop instead of either of our apartments. Neutral ground, somewhere with other people around, which I think we both silently understood as a way of keeping the conversation calmer than it might have gone otherwise. She looked different somehow, tired in a way that seemed less like avoidance and more like someone actually doing hard internal work, and she waited for me to speak first, which was new for her, because Nat had never been someone who waited for anything. I told her I'd read her message about her childhood, about the pattern, and that it helped me understand the why, but I needed her to understand that the why didn't erase the what, that I still carried this strange low hum of unease sometimes, even in my new apartment with new locks. This occasional flicker of wondering whether privacy was ever really guaranteed with anyone, and that healing from that wasn't going to happen just because I understood her reasons better. She nodded and said she wasn't expecting instant forgiveness, that she knew this was going to take actual time, maybe more time than either of us wanted to admit sitting there in that coffee shop. She told me something else that day too, something that genuinely surprised me. She said that in the process of unpacking all of this in therapy, she realized she needed to tell someone else too, someone from years earlier. A woman she'd lived near in her early 20s, who she'd also let herself in on multiple occasions during a specific hard stretch. Someone she hadn't spoken to in years out of guilt. She said she'd reached out, admitted what she'd done, expected to be cut off completely, and instead, the woman had responded with something between shock and relief. Said she'd always had a strange feeling certain things in her apartment were slightly different than she left them, but had always assumed she was imagining it, and that having an explanation, even an uncomfortable one, felt better than the vague unease she'd carried for years without understanding it. I asked Nat why she was telling me this,
And she said because she wanted me to know she wasn't just doing this conversation with me and calling it finished, that she was trying to actually go back and take responsibility everywhere this pattern had shown up, not just where she'd gotten caught. That mattered to me more than I expected it to, because it suggested this wasn't purely about salvaging our specific friendship, that she was doing the harder, less convenient work, even in places where there was nothing left for her to gain from it. We didn't fully repair things that day. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this sometimes get flattened into either total forgiveness or total severance. And the truth of what actually happened between us lived in a much messier middle place for a long time. I told her I wasn't ready to give her a key to my new apartment. Not now, maybe not ever. And that this wasn't a punishment, so much as a fact about where my trust actually was. And she said that made complete sense. That she wasn't expecting it, wasn't asking for it. We started seeing each other again, slowly after that. Coffee here and there, a walk sometimes. Always somewhere neutral. Always with an ease that had to be rebuilt in small pieces, rather than assumed the way it used to be. It's been almost 2 years now since that night I found the key in her bowl by accident, and our friendship exists in some different shape than it used to, quieter in certain ways, more careful, but also somehow more honest than it had been, even before any of this happened, because now there's nothing left hidden underneath it. No secret room I don't know about, at least not one I'm aware of, and I've made a strange kind of peace with the fact that maybe no relationship ever fully guarantees that. That trust isn't really about certainty. It's about choosing to stay open to someone anyway, carefully, with your eyes open this time. Watching a little more closely than you used to, but choosing it all the same. Because the alternative, closing yourself off from everyone who might disappoint you, felt like its own kind of loss I wasn't willing to accept either. There's a part of this I haven't told anyone outside of my therapist, and I think it belongs here, because it changed how I understood the whole story, not just the ending of it. About 4 months after Nat and I started slowly rebuilding whatever this new version of our friendship was going to be, I went back through the old footage one more time. All of it. Every single clip saved from those 2 years. Because something in me needed to know exactly how many times, exactly what she'd done, down to the last detail. Most of it was what I already knew. Standing in my living room, sitting on my couch, rinsing that chipped mug. But there was one clip, buried near the middle of the folder, time-stamped almost a year before I ever found the key in her bowl, that I had somehow never opened. I don't know why I skipped it the first time. Maybe I'd been too overwhelmed to watch everything in order. I pressed play, and it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at, because at first, the frame just showed my bedroom, dark, empty, nothing moving. Then the door opened slowly, and Nat stepped inside. And she wasn't there to sit on the couch or straighten a picture frame this time. She walked to the edge of my bed, where I was asleep. Actually asleep, completely unaware. And she stood there for a long moment, just looking at me. Then she raised her phone and took a photo. One photo. She didn't linger after that, didn't touch anything, just turned around and left the way she'd come in, locking the door behind her exactly like always. I sat there afterward feeling something I can only describe as a different kind of cold than what I'd felt before, because everything else, the mug, the doorway, the crooked frame, all of that had felt invasive in an abstract way, a presence I hadn't agreed to. This was different. This was my actual sleeping face, captured and kept somewhere on her phone without my knowledge. And I had no idea what she'd done with it since. Whether she'd looked at it again, saved it, deleted it, and not knowing was almost worse than knowing would have been. When I finally asked her about it weeks later, she went pale in a way I hadn't seen even during our first real conversation. She said it happened only once, a night she'd let herself in during a particularly bad stretch, feeling like she needed proof that somewhere in the world there was a version of peace she could still recognize. And seeing me asleep, safe, undisturbed, had felt like exactly that. She said she deleted the photo the next morning, disgusted with herself, and she swore she never did anything like it again. I don't know if I believe that completely, and I told her so, and she didn't argue with me about it, just nodded, and said she understood why I wouldn't. That same week, digging for answers about the very beginning of all of this, I finally learned the real story of how she'd gotten the key copied in the first place. And it wasn't what she'd told me during our first conversation. She hadn't improvised it at a hardware store counter on a whim. It went back further than that. Years earlier, on a completely ordinary night, nothing special, no wine, no big conversation, Nat had asked to borrow my keys for a few minutes. Said she needed to grab something out of her car and didn't want to walk back up for her own set. I remember handing them over without a second thought, because why wouldn't I? And going back to whatever we were doing while she went downstairs. What actually happened, she finally admitted, was that she'd driven to a 24-hour hardware store a few streets over, had my apartment key copied on the spot, while I sat upstairs assuming she was just outside at her car, and drove straight back before I even noticed how long she'd been gone. She said the whole trip took less than 15 minutes. She said she'd planned it days in advance, had already looked up which stores nearby could cut a key that late, had rehearsed the excuse about her car so it would sound natural if I ever questioned the timing. Hearing that changed something for me, because it meant this had never been some impulsive, unplanned moment of weakness at a counter, the way she'd first described it. It meant she had thought about this in advance, deliberately, and built a small, convincing lie specifically to make it possible, which was a very different thing than a spontaneous bad decision made under emotional pressure. I asked her why she'd lied about that specific detail, even after admitting to everything else. And she said she genuinely didn't know. Maybe because the planned version made her sound worse, more calculating, less like someone spiraling and more like someone who had simply decided, in advance, that my privacy wasn't something she needed to ask permission for. I want to be honest that I'm not writing this as some story about forgiveness, because that's not what this is. I don't forgive her, not fully, and I've stopped feeling guilty about that. What I have instead is something closer to permanent, low-grade distrust, a kind of watchfulness that never fully turns off. Nat still doesn't have a key to my current place, and she never will again. That part I'm completely certain of. But something happened about 7 months after that last conversation that told me more about where things actually stood than any conversation could have. She came over on a Sunday, our usual routine restored in its smaller, quieter form, and she left around 9, hugging me at the door the way she always did now, careful, a little formal, like both of us were still relearning the correct distance to stand at. I went to bed not long after and didn't think about her again until the next morning, when I grabbed my keys off the little dish by my front door, the new dish in the new apartment, and something about the way they were sitting struck me as wrong. Not moved exactly, just angled differently than I remembered leaving them the night before. I stood in my kitchen with my coffee going cold, staring at a key dish, feeling my whole body go rigid in a way I hated, because it meant some part of me was still, after everything, permanently braced for this. I checked the camera. I still have one, mounted differently now, angled toward that exact spot near the door, something I never told Nat about and never planned to. My hands were shaking pulling up the footage from the night before, cycling back to the timestamp right before she left, and there she was, moving toward the door to grab her jacket, pausing near the dish the way anyone might pause near anything sitting close to where they're standing. She looked at the keys. I watched her actually look at them, longer than a glance, those few seconds stretching out long enough that my stomach dropped and I felt 11 months of careful rebuilding collapse in real time behind my ribs. Then she looked away, picked up her jacket instead, and walked out the door without touching them at all.
I sat there afterward, feeling almost embarrassed by how completely my body had already convinced me it was happening again. How fast I'd built an entire story in my head. Another copy. Another year of not knowing. All from a slightly angled key dish and a few seconds of her eyes drifting somewhere they shouldn't have needed to. Nothing happened. She looked, and she stopped herself, and she left. I don't know if that's supposed to be reassuring. Some days I decide it is. Proof that whatever she's actually working on in therapy has taken hold in some real, tested way. That she can stand 3 feet from an old temptation and simply not reach for it anymore. Other days I think about how long her eyes stayed there. That stretch just slightly too long. And I wonder if what I actually witnessed wasn't recovery at all, just better restraint. A newer, quieter version of the same pull, managed instead of gone. I haven't told her about the footage. I don't think I ever will. It isn't information she needs to have, and honestly, some part of me wants to keep watching without her knowing there's anything left to watch. Because that's the arrangement now, whether either of us says it out loud or not. I know that isn't healthy either. I know secretly testing someone isn't what trust is supposed to look like. That running a silent check every time she comes near my door isn't the behavior of someone who's actually moved past anything. But apparently, this is where I am right now, and I've stopped pretending otherwise, just to come across better in my own story. She goes on with her life, doing all the things a person trying to change is supposed to do. Therapy, honesty, the slow, visible effort of it. Whether any of that has actually rewired the impulse underneath, I genuinely don't know. And I'm not sure she does either. So I go on, watching a little longer than a person should have to watch her closest friend, checking a key dish out of the corner of my eye every time she stands near my door. I used to think trust was something you either had completely or didn't have at all. I don't think that anymore. I think some relationships just end up living permanently in this in-between place, not broken enough to end, not whole enough to relax into, something you keep showing up for with your eyes open instead of closed. Nat never copied another key, not once, not since. But to this day, every time she looks toward mine, I'm already looking back at her.